Imagine candlelight flickering over the polished floors of the Château de Blois. The air smells faintly of beeswax and herbs. Sage, rosemary, perhaps something more bitter. Something you can't quite name. It is France sometime around the year 1533, and the court is alive with whispers. The woman at the center of them, small, dark-eyed, and oddly composed, is not yet the fearsome poison queen of rumor. She is a teenage bride from Florence, barely 14, named Catherine de Medici. She does not speak much French yet, and the courtiers mock her accent behind their fans. They see her as an outsider, a curiosity, a girl from a merchant family who somehow married into the Valois dynasty. But they forget, or perhaps they never knew, that Catherine is no mere merchant's daughter. She is a Medici, heir to one of the most powerful banking dynasties in Europe. Her blood carries the quiet authority of Florentine politics, where money and power intertwine like vines around marble. At this point in her life, Catherine is not powerful. She is small, clever, and intensely observant. Her husband Henry, Duke of Orleans, is indifferent to her. His heart and much of his attention belong to another, the elegant and older Diane de Poitiers, whose calm beauty and sharp mind dominate Henry's affections for decades. For a young bride in the French court, such a situation is not uncommon. But Catherine feels the chill of isolation deeply. She studies her surroundings the way one might study a locked door, looking for cracks, for weaknesses, for a way to survive. The French court of the early 1500s was a place of ceremony, superstition, and subtle cruelty. Every meal was a test of hierarchy. Every gesture could be read as an insult. Catherine learned quickly that survival in such an environment required patience, observation, and control, qualities that would later define her reign. Her first challenge was the most personal one. She could not produce an heir. For 10 long years, Catherine remained childless. Her position was precarious, her marriage fragile. Henry's father, King Francis I, considered annulling the union. Courtiers whispered that she was cursed barren, perhaps even punished by God for her family's sins in Italy. But Catherine's response was not despair, it was persistence. She turned to medicine, astrology, and the strange sciences of her homeland. Italy, after all, was a land of experimenters. Catherine's uncle had corresponded with scholars who studied alchemy, and Florence itself was filled with apothecaries whose jars of powdered roots and dried insects lined shelves like silent witnesses to human desperation. Through her Italian attendants, Catherine began consulting with physicians and herbalists. They prescribed strange remedies, ground pearls, goat's milk, tinctures of amber. Some might have been useless, others dangerous, but Catherine followed them all faithfully. Then, unexpectedly, her fortune changed. In 1544, after nearly a decade of disappointment, Catherine gave birth to a son, Francis. The relief at court was immense. One child followed another, 10 in total, though many would not survive infancy. Catherine's status transformed overnight from an Italian burden to a French matriarch. Her husband began to treat her with something resembling respect, though his heart still belonged to Diane. And yet, even in this newfound acceptance, Catherine remained an outsider. The courtiers called her the Italian. They mistrusted her strange habits, the perfumes she favored, the astrologers she kept, the quiet men in black who followed her through the corridors. She brought new foods to France, artichokes, spinach, even forks, and these too were subjects of gossip. Everything foreign about her seemed suspect. Still, Catherine adapted. She built her own network of spies and informants, gathering knowledge quietly like a spider building her web in the rafters. When King Francis I died in 1547 and Henry became King Henry VI, Diane de Poitiers remained the king's chief influence. Catherine was Queen of France in name, but her power was limited. She watched, she waited, and she learned. It is during these years that her reputation as the Poison Queen would begin to germinate, though there is no proof she ever poisoned anyone. The rumors grew because of what she represented: the cunning, educated, foreign woman who understood the invisible forces that frightened men. Catherine's astrologer, Nostradamus, once visited the court during this period. He predicted that the king would die in a duel, pierced through the eye. Catherine, it is said, took this prophecy to heart, though perhaps not seriously enough. In 1559, during a justing tournament celebrating the marriage of her daughter Elizabeth to Philip Seri of Spain, Henry VII insisted on competing. Catherine begged him not to, recalling Nostradamus's warning. But Henry laughed it off. He was struck in the eye by a splintered lance. He lingered in agony for 10 days before dying, leaving Catherine a widow, and suddenly the most powerful woman in France. The death changed everything. Her eldest son, Francis II, was only 15. Catherine was now Queen Mother, and more importantly, regent, the guardian of the young king and the realm. France at that time was a country divided. Beneath the polished rituals of court life, tensions between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants were beginning to fracture the kingdom. Catherine found herself at the heart of these divisions, a woman surrounded by men with swords and agendas. To maintain peace, she walked a fine line, mediating between factions, issuing cautious decrees and trying to balance the impossible. But peace was not something easily sustained. Francis Sue's reign was brief. He died in 1560, barely a year after ascending the throne. Catherine's second son, Charles X, then became king, but he was only 10 years old. Once again, Catherine ruled as regent. The years that followed were marked by instability. France was spiraling toward the wars of religion, and Catherine, always calculating, sought to prevent civil war through negotiation and marriage. One of her most famous political strategies was the marriage between her daughter Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, an attempt to reconcile the two faiths. But history does not often reward moderation. As the political winds shifted, Catherine found herself vilified by both sides, the Catholics who accused her of weakness, and the Protestants who accused her of deceit. The legend of the Poison Queen began to grow stronger now. Her reliance on Italian advisors, her interest in the occult sciences, her elaborate banquets where political rivals mysteriously fell ill, all these became fodder for dark tales. In truth, Catherine's court was one of the most advanced in Europe. She built observatories, commissioned mechanical marvels, and collected rare manuscripts. She employed perfumers who crafted medicinal bombs and protective elixirs, many of which were later mistaken for poisons. But perception in politics is often stronger than truth. As the wars intensified, Catherine began to lose her grip on the delicate balance she had maintained. Her son Charles IX was impressionable, emotional, and easily swayed by the violence around him. And so, one of the darkest nights in French history approached, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Yet in this first act of her story, Catherine remains a study in contrasts, a woman who loved art and beauty, yet presided over bloodshed, a foreigner who became the heart of a divided France, a mother who tried to preserve her dynasty, only to watch it crumble piece by piece. The girl who once studied herbs in secret now ruled a kingdom built on distrust and fear. But before the night of the massacre, before her name became synonymous with poison and treachery, Catherine de Medici was still, in many ways, a survivor, a woman shaped by loss, calculation, and the unrelenting need to hold power in a world that denied it to her kind. And so we end this first part in silence, with Catherine standing at the window of the Louvre, watching the river flow below, her face unreadable, her thoughts hidden. She is queen, yes, but of what kind of kingdom? Is power ever worth the poison it demands? The sound of France in the 1560s was not one of peace. It was the echo of church bells mingling with the thud of marching boots, the sharp, sudden cries of towns where neighbours had turned upon neighbours. For Queen Mother Catherine de Medici, now the central figure in the royal court, this noise was a constant reminder that her kingdom was breaking apart. The Reformation had reached France like a spreading fire, its spark carried across the Alps from Geneva and Wittenberg. What began as murmurs of dissent against church corruption had become open rebellion. Huguenots, as French Protestants were called, grew in number, nobles among them, educated men, even members of the royal family. Catherine, pragmatic as ever, did not care deeply for theology. She was no theologian, no prophet, merely a ruler trying to preserve what little order remained. Her goal was not the victory of one faith over another, but the survival of the crown itself. Her son, King Charles X, was still a boy, impressionable and anxious. Catherine surrounded him with advisors she trusted, or thought she could trust, yet every choice she made carried a cost. At court, two powerful factions emerged. On one side stood the House of Guise, staunch Catholics who sought to purge France of heresy. On the other, the House of Bourbon, supporters of the Protestant cause. Between them, Catherine tried to stand, the mediator, the mother, the keeper of balance. To understand her dilemma, imagine the map of France as it was then a patchwork of loyalties. Cities like Rouen, La Rochelle, and Entmes leaned toward Protestantism. Others, like Paris, were fiercely Catholic. Each region had its own soldiers, its own banners, its own grievances. Catherine called for colloquies, meetings between theologians of both sides. She hoped, perhaps Narvelli, that reason could heal what faith had divided. The Colloquy of Poissy, held in 1561, brought together bishops and Protestant ministers, including the brilliant theologian Theodore Beza. They debated scripture before the young King Charles, and the Queen Mother herself. But reason, as Catherine soon learned, has little power against conviction. The discussions collapsed in anger, each side left more entrenched than before. By 1562, war had come. The First War of Religion erupted after the massacre of Vassy, when the Duke of Guise's men attacked a congregation of Huguenots during their worship. Dozens were slaughtered. The event rippled through France like a stone dropped in still water, and the nation convulsed into open conflict. For Catherine, it was the nightmare she had tried to prevent. She travelled constantly between warring camps, pleading, commanding, negotiating. Letters flowed from her hand in all directions. Letters to generals, to ambassadors, to her own children. Each line bore the careful handwriting of a woman balancing desperation and authority. Her strategies were never purely military. She used marriage as a weapon, diplomacy as a shield. She wrote to Elizabeth I of England, to Philip II of Spain, to the Pope. France, she insisted, must remain whole. The wars dragged on for years. Treaties were signed and broken. Cities fell, were retaken, fell again. Famine spread. Disease followed. Catherine aged quickly in those years. She still rode on horseback during her royal progresses, dressed in mourning black, her expression solemn and unreadable. The colour became her symbol, not only of widowhood but of endurance. Even her children began to see her not as a mother, but as a ruler, a distant, almost spectral presence. Charles Ix, the boy king, grew restless under her constant watch. He sought the counsel of men who promised decisive action, the Duke of Guise among them. Catherine saw the danger but could not entirely stop it. Then came the idea of peace through marriage, a concept as fragile as it was bold. Her daughter, Margaret of Valois, would marry Henry of Navarre, the leading Protestant noble and heir to the Bourbon line. This union, Catherine hoped, would bind the two faiths through blood. The wedding would take place in Paris, under the gaze of the Catholic court. It was a risky plan. Many Catholics opposed it, fearing it would legitimize heresy. Protestants viewed it with suspicion, seeing it as a trap. Yet Catherine pressed forward, determined to show unity, even if only for appearances. The celebrations began in August 1572. Paris was filled with foreign guests, banners, music, and uneasy silence beneath the noise. The weather was warm, the air heavy, but peace, once again, proved an illusion. Days after the wedding, an attempt was made on the life of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the Protestant leaders. He was shot in the street, wounded but not killed. The Huguenots were outraged and tensions soared. Catherine found herself at the centre of a storm. Her son, King Charles Ix, was torn. His mother urging calm, his advisers urging vengeance. The Duke of Guise demanded action. The city seethed with hatred. And then on the night of August 23, 1572, the bells of Paris began to ring. It was the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day. No one knows exactly who gave the order. Some say it was Catherine herself, desperate to eliminate the Protestant leadership before they could retaliate. Others claim it was Charles Ix, overcome by fear and manipulated by his counsellors. What followed was chaos. The city's streets became rivers of blood. Protestant nobles were dragged from their beds, their homes looted and burned. The Seine filled with bodies. The massacre spread beyond Paris, to Orléans' Lyon-Tillos, a wave of violence that engulfed France for weeks. Tens of thousands perished. Catherine, cloaked in black, walked through the halls of the Louvre as rumours swirled around her. Some said she laughed as the killings began. Others said she prayed. The truth is uncertain, hidden beneath centuries of interpretation and propaganda. In the aftermath, Catherine's reputation was sealed. Foreign ambassadors wrote of her with horror. Protestant nations depicted her as a serpent, Italian Jezebel. Even in France, her image darkened. The woman behind the massacre, the mother who had poisoned her own sons with blood and deceit. Yet Catherine's purpose, if she had one, was not wanton cruelty. It was control. She sought to restore order through fear, to end rebellion before it consumed the monarchy entirely. But the result was the opposite. The killings deepened division, destroyed trust, and set France on a course of decades, long strife. For Catherine, it was a turning point, perhaps even a surrender. Her letters after the massacre reveal a tone of exhaustion. She spoke often of necessity and fate, as if the events were inevitable, beyond her control. And yet, she continued to rule. After Charles Ix's health began to fail, tormented by guilt and illness, her next son Henry Assur ascended the throne. He was more independent, more suspicious of his mother's influence. Still, Catherine remained at the heart of politics, her mind as sharp as ever. She worked tirelessly to preserve what little remained of the Valois dynasty, navigating assassinations, conspiracies, and uprisings. The world she had tried to hold together was fracturing before her eyes. Once she had imagined France as a great garden, ordered, cultivated, ruled by reason and hierarchy, but now it seemed wild, overgrown, devouring itself. Her astrologers offered new predictions. Some said her line would end in tragedy. Others whispered that she would live to see all her sons die before her. Catherine said little. She had seen too much to be surprised by prophecy. She continued her daily rituals, walking the corridors of her palaces, consulting her physicians, writing letters late into the night. Her servants spoke of the faint, bitter scent that followed her everywhere, a mix of perfumes and herbs. Outside her chambers, France continued to burn. And so, as this second part of her story draws to its quiet close, we find Catherine once again at the center of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes after a storm. She stands before her mirror, the candles low, her face lined with time and worry. Her crown feels heavy, her legacy uncertain. Was she the savior of France or its destroyer? Perhaps in the end, she was merely what history so often forgets to honor, a survivor. The year is 1580. Outside the palace windows, the French winter lies heavy and damp, pressing grey clouds against the city. Inside, Queen Mother Catherine de Medici moves through the corridors of Blois with deliberate steps. Her knees ache, and she leans on a cane carved from dark walnut. A gift, she says, from an old Italian craftsman who once served her father. She is now in her 60s, though in the portraits of the time she seems older. Her face has grown thin, her black gowns hang loosely about her frame. Yet there is still a kind of strength in her bearing, not the brilliance of youth, but the endurance of habit. Catherine has lived long enough to see 3 of her sons wear the crown of France, and one after another, to see them fall. After the death of Charles X, her second surviving son Henry III became king. Henry was elegant, intelligent, and strange, a ruler who loved ceremony more than governance. He surrounded himself with young courtiers he called his mignons, adorned the court with scented gloves and velvet ribbons, and filled the palaces with music and processions. To many, he seemed frivolous. To Catherine, he was fragile. She still advised him, sometimes gently, sometimes sternly, reminding him that beneath the silks and incense, France was still bleeding. The wars of religion had not ended with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. They had merely shifted form. Now, factions rose and fell like tides: the Catholic League, the Huguenot forces, the exhausted crown that stood between them. The Duke of Guise, triumphant leader of the Catholic League, grew ever bolder, gathering his own armies, his own supporters. In the taverns of Paris, men shouted his name instead of the king's. For a monarch who prized dignity, this was intolerable. Catherine understood what was coming long before Henry did. She had seen too many ambitious men rise under the pretense of faith. Still, she tried to mediate one last time, to weave from threads of diplomacy and flattery a fragile peace. In 1588, the Estates General convened at Blois. It was meant to restore order. Instead, it became the stage for betrayal. On a cold December morning, Henry III summoned the Duke of Guise to his chambers. The Duke entered, confident, his sword left at the door, a courtesy to the crown. Moments later, royal guards seized him. When he reached for the crucifix at his neck, they struck him down. The sound of the struggle echoed through the corridors. Catherine, confined to her apartments by illness, heard the commotion. When the guards told her the Duke of Guise was dead, she sighed, not in triumph but in weary resignation. "I fear," she murmured, "you have cut off more than one head. You have loosed a war." She was right. The Catholic League revolted. Paris rose against the king. Priests preached rebellion from their pulpits. Once again the kingdom burned. Catherine's health declined rapidly in those months. She continued to write letters, hundreds of them, to ambassadors, to generals, to her children. Her handwriting trembled, but her sentences remained precise, her mind clear. She still believed in order, in the fragile machinery of monarchy that she had protected all her life. But her world was collapsing faster than her pen could mend it. In January 1589, Catherine de Medici died quietly at the age of 69. The official record says she passed away of pneumonia, worn out by years of fatigue. Those close to her said she asked, in her final hours, to be left alone. No priests, no courtiers, only her ladies in waiting in the flicker of a single candle. The king, her last surviving son, was too consumed by rebellion to attend her burial. Within months, he too would be assassinated, stabbed by a fanatic monk. With Henry Ali's death, the Valois dynasty ended. The crown passed to Henry of Navarre, her son-in-law, who became Henry IV, a Protestant who converted to Catholicism for peace, famously saying that Paris is worth a mass. Catherine had tried all her life to preserve her family's line. In the end, It was her daughter's husband who carried the crown into a new age. The irony, she might have appreciated; the defeat, she would have understood. When we look back on Catherine de Medici now, it is often through a fog of myth. We remember her as the poison queen, the schemer, the mother of massacres. We imagine her surrounded by alchemists, whispering over bubbling flasks, her hands stained by deceit. But the truth, though less thrilling, is far more human, and perhaps more haunting. Catherine was a ruler born into a world that did not welcome women of power. She was taught from childhood to survive by calculation, to bend without breaking. Her weapons were intellect, patience, and fear. She governed a country divided by faith and pride, where every decision had the weight of blood behind it. Her poisons, if we can call them that, were not vials of venom but words, treaties, and compromises, the subtle arts of preservation. She built gardens and observatories. She introduced perfumes and fine cooking to the French court. She commissioned architects and painters who would shape the Renaissance in France. She brought elegance to chaos, refinement to cruelty. Yet history, restless and impatient, prefers villains to caretakers. Catherine's contemporaries, unable to believe a woman could command politics through intellect alone, turned her prudence into witchcraft. And so the legend grew, that she kept poison in her rings, that her astrologers foretold death, that her black dresses hid a blacker soul. In truth, she was simply a ruler in a collapsing world, and in such worlds mercy is often mistaken for manipulation. When the palace at Blois was searched after her death, the attendants found rooms filled not with poisons but with books, maps, and letters. The evidence of a life lived through the slow, exhausting labor of governance. Among them was a small notebook, filled with notes on the weather, the moon, and the movements of stars. The handwriting was hers. On the last page, the ink faint and fading, she had written a line in Italian. "Everything is lost save honor." It is uncertain whether those were her words or something she copied, but they feel true to her, the sentiment of a woman who gave everything to preserve dignity in the face of ruin. Outside her tomb in St. Denis centuries later, tourists pass quietly. Her marble effigy lies beside Henry I's, her face serene, her hands folded in prayer. Few stop to think of the real woman beneath the stone. The Italian girl who became the mother of a dying dynasty, who ruled through plague, war, and rumor, and who left behind a country both wounded and transformed. She is still there, in a sense, in every story of France's uneasy balance between faith and power. She is there in the perfume of courtly intrigue, in the architecture of the Louvre she helped to expand, in the strange persistence of myths that refuse to fade. And perhaps, when you think of her tonight, not as the poison queen, but as the patient widow of kings, you might feel a quiet sympathy. For in her own way, Catherine de Medici embodies the lesson of so much boring history, that survival itself is often the greatest act of power. As the last candle of this story burns low, her world slips back into silence. The halls of Blois are empty now, the echo of her footsteps long gone. Only the river still flows beneath the windows where she once stood, watching, thinking, planning. History moves on, but it carries her scent still, faint, persistent, and impossible to forget. Was she a monster or merely human? And does it matter? When both are bound so tightly in the fabric of power, the story begins not in a palace, but in a room that smells of parchment and dust. The air is dry, filled with the faint whisper of quills scratching against vellum. In a narrow office inside the imperial palace at Valladolid, a man bends over his desk, surrounded by stacks of ledgers. The year is 1542, and his name is Francisco de los Cobos, secretary to Emperor Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and as his subjects like to say, of half the world. Outside, the empire is enormous, chaotic, and dazzling. It stretches from the silver mines of Peru to the frozen forests of Germany, from the dusty plains of Castile to the bustling ports of the Netherlands. Armies march, ships set sail, and kings kneel before the emperor. Yet here, in this small, silent room, the empire exists only in numbers, in lines of ink that balance glory against debt. Francisco de los Cobos was not a nobleman. He was born in the modest town of Drubeda, in southern Spain, a place of olive groves, crickets, and limestone houses glowing pale under the Andalusian sun. His father was a minor bureaucrat, his mother, a woman of sharp intelligence and quiet ambition. From an early age, Francisco learned two lessons that would define him: that paper moves faster than swords, and that patience is more powerful than pride. He entered royal service as a clerk at just 17, copying documents for hours in the dim light of candles that smoked and stung his eyes. He rose slowly, invisibly, the way all true bureaucrats do. When Charles became emperor in 1519, Cobos was already part of the administrative machinery that ran Spain's new empire. By the time this story takes place, he was the emperor's most trusted financial mind, the man who turned conquest into coin. If Charles V was the body of empire, Cobos was its nervous system. Every tax, every shipment, every royal payment passed through his hands. The emperor trusted him more than he trusted most princes, because Cobos never sought a crown, only a ledger that balanced. The empire on paper, the empire of Charles V, was vast, but it was also broke. War, as it always does, drained the treasury. The emperor's campaigns against France, the Ottomans, and the Protestant princes of Germany consumed fortunes faster than they could be collected. Spain's new colonies in the Americas were producing unimaginable wealth in silver and gold. But it arrived slowly, and much of it was already promised to bankers before the ships even left Seville. It fell to Cobos to make sense of this impossible system, to take a world too large for any map and translate it into columns of arithmetic. Each morning began the same way. Cobos would light a candle, open his books, and trace his finger down the margins of the empire, the income from Castile's wool trade, the tax receipts from Flanders, the tribute from Naples, the shipments from the Indies. He knew them all by memory. The sums were vast but rarely stable. Every victory demanded more spending, every peace, more debt. When the emperor wrote from the front, tired, sick, still fighting, his letters often ended with a plea, "Francisco, find me the money." And somehow, Cobos always did. He created a web of loans and promises that tied Europe's greatest financiers to the Spanish crown, the Fugger and Welser families of Augsburg, the Spinolas of Genoa, the Grimaldis of Lucca. Their fortunes rose and fell on the confidence of this one quiet man in Valladolid. It was not glamour that sustained Cobos, but the strange satisfaction of order. His handwriting was precise, his calculations careful. To him, numbers were not abstract. They were the pulse of power. He once wrote in a private note, found years later in his archives, "The empire is made of men and paper. When the men fail, the paper must endure." The emperor's shadow, Cobos was not a man who sought the emperor's company often. Yet Charles V relied on him in a way that few men could comprehend. When the emperor met with his council, Cobos sat near the back, speaking rarely, listening always. Charles was a man of immense energy and melancholy, soldier, scholar, and ruler in one body. He had inherited Spain, Austria, Burgundy, and the New World all at once. His eyes were always tired. His jaw, famously protruding, the mark of generations of inbreeding, gave him a stern expression, but his letters to Cobos were surprisingly tender. "You are the one who brings order to my confusion," he wrote. Cobos served him faithfully through wars and treaties, through the diet of worms, through the endless battles with France and the Protestant princes. He never fought, never commanded, never rode into glory. Yet his work determined whether the troops were paid, the ships built, the supplies sent. Without him, the empire would have cracked under its own weight. Still, he was not loved. At court, nobles sneered at the accountant who sat at the emperor's ear. They whispered that he grew rich from commissions, that he was too cautious, too dull, too slow. They mocked his plain clothes and his lack of charm. But Cobos understood something they did not, that history rarely remembers the men who balance ledgers, yet it depends on them completely. The quiet power in 1543, Cobos's power reached its height. He controlled royal finances, colonial policy, and the management of Spain's army paymasters. His home in Valladolid became a labyrinth of archives. Visitors described rooms filled with shelves upon shelves of parchment. The heartbeat of empire stacked in bundles tied with twine. He worked 12 hours a day, often longer. He ate little, slept rarely, and avoided the grand banquets of the court. When asked once what pleasure he found in life, he replied simply, "Precision." It is easy to forget that the empires of history, Rome, Byzantium, Spain, did not run on glory alone. They ran on the slow, invisible work of people like him, clerks, auditors, scribes, archivists. Without their discipline, no crown could last more than a generation. Cobos's influence was so complete that foreign ambassadors began to court him as if he were a prince. He could delay a war with a few lines of penmanship, or hasten one with a missing signature. Yet he remained cautious, distant, as though he understood that power obtained quietly must also be held quietly. Shadows of decline, but even the most meticulous lives fray at the edges. By the late 1540s, Cobos was aging. His eyes had grown weak from decades of reading by candlelight. The piles of ledgers seemed endless now, heavier than ever. The empire he had helped build was cracking beneath the strain of its ambition. Charles's wars continued. The debts multiplied. Revolts simmered in the Netherlands. pirates stalked the Atlantic trade routes. Cobos began to realize what no ruler ever wished to admit, that empires, like ledgers, never truly balance. In private, he grew more reflective. He built a small chapel in his hometown of Drubeda, a quiet retreat of marble and soft candlelight. Its ceilings were carved with geometric patterns, symbols of order in a disordered world. He wrote to a friend, "The numbers grow, but the peace does not. Perhaps it is not gold we need, but patience." The emperor visited him only rarely now. Charles himself was weary, burdened by the empire's immensity. They exchanged letters full of gratitude, regret, and exhaustion, the correspondence of two old men who had once believed that the world could be ruled by will alone. Cobos died in 1547, just months before Charles began his slow withdrawal from politics, a retreat that would end in the monastery of Yuste. When the imperial archivists took stock of Cobos's papers after his death, they found thousands of ledgers, each neatly dated and labeled. Together they formed a portrait of the 16th century more complete than any chronicle. Among them, one final note in his own hand: "There is no peace without order, and no order without the humble work that no one sees." The candles in his office burned low. Outside, the empire continued to move, ships sailing, soldiers marching, couriers riding through the night with orders written by another man's hand. Francisco de los Cobos was forgotten within a generation. His wealth faded, his family line dissolved, but the systems he built, the habits of administration, the machinery of modern government, survived. It is a quiet immortality, the kind history rarely celebrates. And yet, when you think of the great empires of the past, perhaps it's worth remembering behind every emperor's dream, there was always someone, somewhere, adding up the cost. The empire endures, but at what price? And who in the end truly ruled, the man with the crown or the man with the pen? When Francisco de los Cobos died in 1547, the emperor's clerks sealed his study with wax. The smell of old paper hung heavy in the air. Stacked on every table were ledgers bound in worn leather, each filled with the details of a world's E. How much wool had been exported from Burgos that year? How many cannons had been forged in Milan? How many tons of silver had arrived from Veracruz? For days, the clerks catalogued the papers in silence. They worked by lamplight, their shadows trembling on the walls. Each ledger, each folio was a monument to a lifetime of discipline. One clerk later wrote that it felt like walking through the skeleton of the empire itself. Cobos was gone, but his system remained. The inheritance of silence after his death, the emperor appointed new secretaries, efficient men, competent but uninspired. They inherited his offices, his keys, his methods. Yet what they did not inherit was his restraint. Cobos had understood something most men of power do not, that administration is a moral act. To balance the books of an empire was not only a task of numbers, but of justice, deciding who paid, who profited, who suffered. His successors saw only the machinery, not the meaning. Spain in the 1550s was richer than ever, but also more brittle. The mines of Potosi in modern day Bolivia poured silver into Seville's ports in quantities never seen before. Ships arrived so heavy with treasure that they rode low in the water, their hulls groaning. The sight dazzled Europe. But the gold and silver did not stay long. Within weeks it flowed outward again, to pay for wars in Italy, loans to German bankers, dowries for royal marriages. Spain became the conduit through which the wealth of the New World passed to the creditors of the Old, and behind it all was the bureaucracy Cobos had built, expanding now like a living organism, feeding on its own paperwork. The age of the secretaries, the decades that followed, became known, unofficially, as the age of the secretaries. Every corner of the empire, from Naples to the Indies, was overseen by councils, committees, and clerks. There was the Council of Castile, the Council of War, the Council of the Indies, and the Council of Finance. Each produced endless reports, petitions, and decrees. These were the descendants of Cobos's order, men who believed that the empire could be governed by parchment alone. They were not adventurers, not soldiers, not explorers. They were record keepers, archivists, and accountants. They measured the world not in leagues or battles, but in shipments, signatures, and seals. Their handwriting became a kind of imperial language, elegant, looping, deliberate. The clerks of Madrid and Valladolid learned to write as their predecessors had written a century earlier, their script unchanged, their phrases repeating like prayers. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, something began to shift. The empire was too vast to be ruled by correspondence alone. Letters took months to cross the ocean. Decisions made in Madrid were often obsolete by the time they reached Mexico or Lima. Governors improvised, captains made choices without approval. Priests founded settlements before permission arrived. In time, the paper empire began to fall out of sync with the real one. The illusion of control. By 1560, the Spanish treasury was on the brink of collapse. The wars of Charles's son, Philip II, drained the coffers even faster than before. Philip was a man of relentless order, cold, methodical, solitary. In many ways, he was the spiritual heir of Cobos. He believed that good government was not a matter of charisma or conquest, but of control. He surrounded himself with papers, reading reports late into the night. The candlelight flickered across his thin face as he annotated margins in his precise, cautious hand. He did not trust generals or nobles, only information. Under his rule, the bureaucracy grew to monstrous size. In the royal palace, the Escorial, which he built as both a monastery and a seat of power, entire rooms were devoted to archives. The sound of scribes at work echoed through the marble corridors. There were so many reports that few were ever read. A single royal decision might require 50 documents, signed and countersigned, each written in a style so formal that meaning was often lost in courtesy. But Philip persisted, convinced that with enough paper, the empire could be perfected. It was a comforting illusion, and a dangerous one. The weight of silver. Meanwhile, the river of silver from the Americas continued to swell. Between 1550 and 1600, Spain imported nearly 180 tons of silver each year, enough to pay for dozens of wars. But the silver carried with it a curse. Prices across Europe rose. Inflation spread. The more money Spain brought home, the less it was worth. Farmers could no longer afford bread. Soldiers went unpaid for months at a time. Cobos had once warned that no number, however great, can sustain disorder. His successors ignored the warning. By the 1570s, Spain had declared bankruptcy, not once but twice. The empire that ruled half the world could no longer pay its own clerks. And still the papers kept coming. Letters from the colonies, receipts from the treasuries, edicts, censuses, inventories, all piled higher and higher in the council chambers. The administrators measured their success by how neatly they filed their failures. The ghost of Cobos in the archives of Simancas, a fortress turned into a repository for Spain's state documents. One room was said to be haunted by the ghost of the first secretary. Clerks spoke of hearing faint footsteps at night, the sound of a quill scratching when no one was there. They said it was Cobos, still at work, still balancing the empire's books from beyond the grave. Of course, it was only superstition, but it revealed something true. The bureaucrats who came after him lived in his shadow. They inherited his devotion to order, but not his sense of balance. Cobos had understood that the purpose of paperwork was to serve people. His successors came to believe that the people existed to serve the paperwork. By the 1580s, entire careers were spent producing documents that no one would ever read. Yet to the men of the council chambers, this was not meaningless. It was duty, and in duty, they found purpose. They were, in their way, as faithful as monks. The empire at its stillest. Imagine for a moment standing in one of those council rooms around the year 1590. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of ink and candle wax. A dozen men sit around a table covered in leather, their faces pale in the lamplight. Each is reading from a different report, one from Flanders, one from Peru, one from the Philippines. Outside, carriages rattle on the cobblestones. Inside, only the quiet turning of pages. No one raises his voice. No one rushes. Every word spoken is careful, measured, ceremonial. Decisions take weeks, sometimes months. Yet this is how the empire endures, not in battles, but in patience. The clerks take pride in the monotony. The stillness becomes sacred. Cobos would have understood. The slow unraveling, but history moves even when bureaucracy does not. By the early 1600s, cracks appeared. The Netherlands had rebelled. England had defeated the Spanish Armada. The treasury was again empty. The empire had become like one of Cobos's ledgers, perfectly organized, yet impossible to balance. The administrators continued their work, their faith unshaken. Even as provinces were lost, even as wars drained the last coins from the treasury, they kept writing, stamping, filing. The empire's body was failing, but its nervous system still twitched. The reflex of a giant that no longer knew it was dying. And through it all, the ghost of Francisco de los Cobos seemed to linger, not as a spectre of regret, but as a quiet reminder that order, once created, can outlive the men who conceived it. His handwriting survived in the margins of old decrees. His methods lived on in the way clerks folded their documents. His influence was woven into the very texture of Spain's imperial habit, a faith in the idea that if one could just record everything, one might truly possess it. But can the world ever be contained on paper? Can a sea of ink hold back the tide of history? By the dawn of the 17th century, the Spanish Empire had become something almost impossible to comprehend. It stretched across the world, from the palaces of Madrid to the rainforests of the Philippines, from the gold plains of Mexico to the icy ports of Flanders. It was, in size, the greatest empire Europe had ever known. And yet, in spirit, it was tired. The soldiers fought on, the priests preached, the ships sailed. But the heartbeat of empire was no longer the clash of armies. It was the soft, steady scratching of quills in offices where men wrote, stamped, and signed their names. In these rooms, lit by wavering candles and cooled by the scent of wax and dust, the legacy of Francisco de los Cobos endured. The bureaucrat's inheritance a century after his death. No one at court spoke his name. His portrait hung in a forgotten corridor, its colors fading. But his system lived on in the habits of thousands of unseen clerks. They were known simply as los papeleros, the paper men. They began their days before dawn. They dipped the quills in ink made of oak galls and iron salts. They recorded the daily minutiae of empire cargo manifests, taxes paid, the appointment of priests to distant missions, the number of bolts of cloth sent to Peru, the deaths of minor officials in Seville. To the outside world, their work seemed tedious, but to them it was sacred. They believed that if everything was written, nothing would be lost. That empire was not a thing of land and armies, but of knowledge, of names and numbers preserved forever. It was a faith in permanence that Cobos himself had shared. Yet the world was already changing around them. The slow turning of fortune, Spain's fortunes began to wane. The silver from the New World still flowed, but less steadily. The mines of Potosi were collapsing. The seas grew dangerous with pirates. The once endless flow of wealth slowed to a trickle, while the debts remained immense. The royal treasury declared bankruptcy again in 1607, and again in 1627. The pattern was almost ritual by then. The empire would fall into ruin, restructure its debts, and resume the same habits that caused its decline. The secretaries kept writing through it all. Their ledgers recorded each bankruptcy with the same calm tone as every other event. On this day, the royal treasury has suspended payment to all creditors. No anger, no panic, just ink. It was as though the empire, unable to repair itself, had chosen instead to document its own disintegration. The machinery of memory, what Cobos had created, was no longer an administration. It had become a memory machine. Each new event was added to the archives like another layer of sediment, burying the past beneath orderly strata. In the Royal Archive of Simancas, clerks still sorted and tied bundles of documents with string, just as they had in Cobos's day. There were now millions of pages reports from the Indies, royal decrees, diplomatic letters, inventories, and lists. So many that some archivists joked the papers were breeding in the dark. Travelers who visited the fortress described it as a labyrinth of silence. Corridors lined with shelves, each stacked to the ceiling. A faint smell of paper and age hung in the air. There were stories of clerks who entered in the morning and did not emerge until dusk, their eyes glazed from reading faded ink. Some said it was the truest reflection of Spain itself, a nation preserved in paper. The fall in slow motion, the decline of Spain was not sudden, it was glacial. The 30 Years' War bled the treasury dry. The Dutch Republic broke away for good. The once proud fleets were defeated by storms and enemies alike. By the mid-17th century, the empire still spanned the world, but it no longer ruled it. The nobles blamed the merchants blamed the crown blamed fate. But perhaps the most accurate diagnosis came from a foreign ambassador who wrote, "They have built a government of paper, so thick that no man can move within it." The very bureaucracy that had once been Spain's strength, its precision, its patience, its discipline, had become its cage. To change anything required documents, signatures, and permissions that took months to circulate. Governors acted too late, fleets departed too slow, and the pulse of empire dulled to a sluggish rhythm. The empire had grown so careful that it forgot how to act. The eternal clerk, and yet, in the quiet corners of Madrid and Seville, the clerks continued. They rose before dawn, worked by candlelight, and filed their reports. They had long ceased to imagine that their papers changed anything. Their task was not to rule the world, but to preserve its image. It is a strange kind of immortality, to live through documents rather than deeds. Cobos would have recognized their devotion. He too had believed that history's weight could be carried by precision. But even he might have been surprised to see how his order, once designed to support an empire, had become a kind of faith in itself. The clerks were not heroes or villains. They were simply steady, and in their steadiness lay both Spain's endurance and its decay. The echo of order by the 18th century, Other nations began to learn from Spain's paper empire. The French under Louis XIV built their own vast bureaucracies, modelled on the councils of Madrid. The Austrians adopted its administrative style. Even the British, who mocked Spain's inefficiency, quietly borrowed its systems for managing colonies. Cobos's legacy, the belief that government could be rational, methodical, and documented, had escaped the empire that birthed it. Modern administration was born from these silent rooms, and with it came a paradox: the very methods designed to make power predictable also made it fragile. Every form, every signature, every chain of approval slowed the pulse of decision, but made the world legible. From that paradox, the modern state emerged. A visit to the archives in 1756, a young historian named Juan Bautista Muoz was granted permission to explore the old archives at Simancas. He found them untouched, a century of dust resting on the shelves. He described the experience in his notes. "I felt as though I walked among the ghosts of men who had never left their desks. Their lives remain here, in the margins of reports, in the corrections made by trembling hands. The ink fades, but the will to record does not." He found, tucked into one of the oldest bundles, a letter from Charles V written in his own hand. "To my secretary Cobos, you are the guardian of my world." Muoz copied the line into his journal. He did not know who Cobos was, but he sensed, perhaps, that the letter spoke to something larger than one man. The empire was dying, but the idea of governance, of writing the world into order, had already passed into eternity. The quiet end: when Napoleon's armies invaded Spain in the early 19th century, they looted palaces, burned towns, and toppled kingdoms. But even they hesitated when they reached Simancas. A French general ordered the archives spared, remarking that no empire should destroy its own memory. And so the fortress stood untouched, its papers undisturbed, millions of voices whispering through time. Inside, among the faded bundles, were Cobos's ledgers. The ink had browned to sepia, the pages were fragile as autumn leaves, but his handwriting was still neat, steady, legible. His sums, centuries later, still balanced. The thought that remains in the end: Francisco de los Cobos left behind nothing grand, no armies, no monuments, no heirs, only order. It is easy to overlook the power of such a legacy, but look around the modern world, at every passport, every census, every line in a budget, and you can still see his shadow. The idea that life can be catalogued, measured, controlled, that the world can be written into existence line by line. It is the quiet faith of the bureaucrat, the belief that meaning resides in precision. And yet, perhaps, Cobos himself would have understood the danger of that faith. For even he once wrote, near the end of his life, "The pen rules the world, but it also imprisons it." His words linger, centuries later, in the silence of archives and the rhythm of every administrative heartbeat. So, as you drift into the stillness of this story, imagine the empire of paper. Endless corridors, candlelight flickering, the faint sound of quills scratching. Somewhere, perhaps, the ghost of a secretary still sits at his desk, quietly balancing the world. And as the candles fade, the question remains: was it the empire that made the paperwork, or the paperwork that made the empire? Imagine waking in the middle of the night to the sound of dripping wax. The air is cool, the walls made of stone, and the faint scent of ink hangs in the air like incense. You are inside the Abbey of Monte Cassino, perched high on a mountain in southern Italy. It is the year 985. Outside, Europe is in darkness. Empires have fallen, kings have died, and roads lie in ruin. The Roman world, once bound by aqueducts and laws, has collapsed into fragments. But within this mountain monastery, the light of knowledge still flickers. A monk bends over his desk. His name is Brother Johannes. His hand moves slowly, carefully, tracing Latin letters on parchment. Each stroke of his quill is deliberate. Every few lines he pauses, breathes, and sharpens the point with a small knife. He is copying an old text, a fragment of Aristotle, or perhaps a medical treatise by Galen. Outside, wolves howl in the hills. Inside, the only sound is the turning of pages. The world beyond these walls may not know it, but the future of learning depends on the patience of men like him. The Mountain of Memory, the Abbey of Monte Cassino, was founded centuries earlier by Saint Benedict, the father of Western monasticism. His rule, ora et labora, pray and work, became the rhythm of life for generations of monks. By the 10th century, Monte Cassino was not merely a monastery. It was a fortress of memory. Its thick walls protected more than men, they protected books. Hundreds of them, some older than the monastery itself. Scrolls from ancient Rome, manuscripts from Greece, commentaries from long dead scholars. Most of Europe's libraries had burned or been abandoned. Cities like Rome and Alexandria, once bright with learning, were now quiet. But on this mountain, knowledge survived in silence. The monks of Monte Cassino were not philosophers or scientists. They were copyists, patient, anonymous, precise. Their task was not to invent new ideas, but to preserve old ones. To them, every word was sacred, even the ones they did not understand. The art of copying a medieval scriptorium was a strange, disciplined world. The room was long and narrow, with windows high on the walls to let in cold light. Each desk was a small island of focus. The monks sat wrapped in wool robes, their breath visible in winter. The smell of parchment, animal skin scraped smooth, mixed with that of candle smoke and iron gall ink. They copied not only the Bible, but also the works of pagan authors Cicero, Virgil, Aristotle, Ovid. To modern minds it might seem curious. Why would monks, devoted to prayer, spend their lives transcribing the words of heathens? But to them, knowledge itself was a form of devotion. To copy was to serve God by preserving the order of his creation. Each letter had to be perfect. A single mistake could change meaning, so every page was checked by another monk, and then another. In the margins, they sometimes left small comments, not about theology but about life. One scribe wrote, "It is cold today, my hand is stiff." Another, "I have finished this page, let the reader remember me kindly." These small human notes, hidden between holy words, are the whispers of 1,000 forgotten men. The weight of silence hours passed in quiet concentration. No one spoke. The only rhythm was the scratching of quills and the turning of leaves. At regular intervals, the monastery bell rang, calling the monks to prayer, to meals, to sleep. They moved through their days like clockwork, each task a form of devotion. They did not think of history. They did not imagine the centuries ahead. They simply worked, believing that what they preserved might someday matter. And it did. For in those cold rooms, the foundations of modern civilization were being rebuilt one letter at a time. Without the scribes of Monte Cassino and their counterparts in other monasteries, nearly all of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge would have vanished. The poems of Virgil, the histories of Livy, the geometry of Euclid, all survived because someone, somewhere, chose to copy them by hand in an age when the world no longer cared. They were quite literally the librarians who saved the Middle Ages. The abbot who collected the world around the year 1020, a new abbot took charge of Monte Cassino, Abbot Desiderius. He was not merely a monk but a diplomat, artist and scholar. He believed the monastery could be more than a fortress. It could be a beacon. Under his guidance, Monte Cassino became the intellectual center of Europe. He sent letters to Constantinople requesting Greek manuscripts and to Arab scholars in Sicily asking for translations of forgotten texts. Caravans brought books from distant lands, philosophical treatises, medical manuals, ancient poetry. The abbey's library grew so large that visiting travelers called it the Second Rome. But the copying continued. Dozens of scribes worked in shifts, transcribing the old text into Latin. Some pages were illuminated, not with gaudy gold, but with quiet beauty, intricate vines, small birds, and delicate initials painted in deep blues and reds. Each manuscript was a labor of months, sometimes years. When one was finished, it was placed on a wooden shelf among hundreds of others. The air inside the library was cool and dry, the perfect climate for memory. The cost of knowledge, the work was not without danger. Parchment was expensive. It took the skins of sheep or goats to make a single book. Ink was made from crushed minerals and oak galls. Candles, burned through long nights, consumed more wax than the abbey could produce. Copying was slow, exhausting, and often dangerous for the eyes. Some monks went blind from years of staring at ink by candlelight, yet the abbey endured. Outside, Europe's kingdoms rose and fell. Raiders came and went. Wars flared and faded. But Monte Cassino remained a quiet island untouched until the 11th century, when fire came to the mountain. In 1071, a war between Norman invaders and local princes engulfed the region. The abbey was attacked, looted, and burned. Many of its books were lost. But even then, the monks rebuilt. They salvaged what they could. They recopied what was damaged. And slowly, painstakingly, the library grew again. The seeds of a renaissance centuries later, when scholars in Italy began searching for ancient wisdom, the movement we now call the Renaissance, they turned to the monasteries. At Monte Cassino, they found texts thought lost for 1,000 years, the writings of Plato, Aristotle, and Galen. They carried them to Florence, Venice, and Paris. From there they were printed, studied, and shared. The modern world, its philosophy, its science, its art, was built on words that had survived the dark centuries in the care of quiet monks. Brother Johannes and his successors would never know this. To them, Their work had been humble, almost boring. But without their patience, the chain of knowledge would have been broken forever. The candles burn lower now. The ink dries. Brother Johannes closes his eyes and folds his hands in prayer. Outside, the first light of morning touches the mountain. Somewhere down below, the world continues, noisy, restless, unknowing. But here, in the silence of the abbey, time moves differently. The past is not gone. It is merely waiting, bound in parchment, resting in the dark, alive in every letter they saved. And so the question lingers, soft as turning pages. If memory can survive only by the patience of a few, how many other worlds have vanished simply because no one copied them in time? The story of Monte Cassino did not remain on its mountain. It spread like light through cracks in stone. From Italy to Ireland, from Spain to the frozen north of Scandinavia, monasteries began to form a silent network, a living web of ink, prayer, and endurance. They were not united by armies or kings, but by the fragile idea that knowledge was worth saving, even when the world did not seem to need it. Imagine traveling across medieval Europe in the year 1100. The roads are rough and muddy. Bandits wait in forests. Towns are small, surrounded by walls. But here and there across the landscape stand the familiar silhouettes of monasteries, towers, bells, and the smell of smoke rising from kitchens. Inside, by candlelight, the same slow rhythm beats quill against parchment, page after page, century after century. The island of saints and scholars far to the west, across a stormy sea, lies Ireland, once called the Island of Saints and Scholars. Here, too, the monks copied. But they did it with a particular kind of devotion, one that mingled art and faith. In the scriptorium of Kells, a small monastery surrounded by green fields, the monks created what would become one of the most beautiful manuscripts in history, the Book of Kells. Its pages were not merely words. They were art. Each letter bloomed into spirals, knots, and figures of animals so small they could only be seen in sunlight. Some took months to complete a single page. These Irish monks believed beauty itself was a prayer, that by making a book worthy of divine perfection, they honored the Creator. But beneath the gold and ink lay the same purpose that drove Monte Cassino, to preserve what had come before. The monks of Ireland copied not only scriptures, but ancient poems, genealogies, and fragments of lost Celtic lore. They were archiving a vanishing world. And just as Monte Cassino had endured invasions and fire, so too did Kells. When Viking raiders arrived in the 9th century, they looted and burned, but the monks fled into the countryside carrying the precious book in their arms. It survived, because someone had cared enough to run with it through the rain. The Carolingian script revolution, meanwhile, on the mainland, another kind of preservation was unfolding, one that was less about art and more about order. In the 8th century, the Emperor Charlemagne, the ruler of the Frankish Empire, looked around his vast domain and saw chaos. Languages fractured, scripts varied, and even the Bible existed in conflicting versions. To govern an empire, he realized he needed consistency, and so he turned to the monks. Charlemagne ordered that every monastery under his rule should adopt a new standard of writing, clear, legible, uniform. The result was Carolingian minuscule, the ancestor of our modern lowercase letters. It was a quiet revolution. For the first time in centuries, books across Europe were written in the same recognizable hand. Monks could read one another's work, scholars could share texts, and mistakes became easier to spot. This was more than a technical improvement. It was an act of unity, a way of reconnecting a broken continent through script. Even today, when you look at a printed page, you are seeing the distant echo of a Carolingian scribe's hand. The silent trade of knowledge as centuries passed, the network of monasteries became a kind of postal system for ideas. When one abbey finished copying a manuscript, another might request a copy in return. Letters traveled slowly, carried by foot or on horseback. Books were exchanged like precious relics, wrapped in linen and wax. Sometimes a manuscript traveled hundreds of miles to reach its new home. Along the way, it might be damaged by rain, stolen, or even repurposed. Its parchment scraped clean to make room for another text. These erased pages, called palimpsests, still exist today. Underneath faint layers of ink, scientists have found lost works, poems of Sappho, scientific treatises by Archimedes, hidden under sermons. Each recovered word is like hearing a faint whisper from a voice that should have vanished centuries ago. The cloistered life to modern eyes, the life of a medieval monk, might seem unbearably dull. Days began before dawn with the tolling of the bell. The monks rose in darkness, prayed, ate bread, and filed into the scriptorium. They copied until the bell rang again, signaling another prayer, another meal, another set of pages. There were no distractions, no color, no noise, no comfort beyond wool and silence. But in that monotony they found meaning. Some wrote manuals describing the ideal posture for writing, or how to prepare ink, or how to keep hands steady in winter. Others wrote about the discipline of the mind, how to copy without letting the thoughts wander, how to treat words as if they were sacred relics. In this way, the work of copying became almost meditative. The scribe was not just recording knowledge, he was practicing humility. He did not claim authorship, he did not sign his name, he vanished into the work itself. The quiet spread of libraries. By the 12th century, libraries had begun to multiply. Monasteries like Cluny, Canterbury, and St. Gall built vast collections. Some held thousands of volumes, an unimaginable wealth of parchment and thought. St. Gall, in what is now Switzerland, became famous for its meticulous catalogue system. Each book was given a specific location, marked by wooden tablets, and carefully recorded. In an age before printing, this organization was revolutionary. Visitors described the library as a place of almost holy order. Shelves lined with volumes bound in wood and leather, the air cool and dry, the silence broken only by the sound of sandals on stone. It is said that the monks of St. Gall sometimes read aloud while others listened, because a book was so rare that reading became a communal act. The words filled the air, not just the page. The birth of the university. As knowledge accumulated, it began to spill beyond the cloister. By the late 12th century, scholars in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford began forming groups, informal gatherings to study theology, law, and medicine. From these circles, the first universities emerged, but their foundations were built on monastic labor. Every text used in those early schools, Aristotle's logic, Galen's anatomy, Euclid's geometry, had been copied, preserved, and transmitted by generations of monks. Without that groundwork, the intellectual awakening of Europe could never have begun. The students who sat in Paris classrooms, listening to lectures by candlelight, were unknowingly reading the thoughts of men long dead, kept alive by the patience of unseen scribes. The beginning of the end of hand, copied knowledge. In the mid-15th century, a German craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg built a new kind of press. His invention, movable type, made it possible to print hundreds of identical pages in the time it once took a monk to copy one. At first, the monasteries were suspicious. Some feared that printing would cheapen sacred texts. Others worried it would spread heresy. But soon, even the church recognized the power of this new tool. By the end of the century, printed books filled the same libraries that once echoed with the scratch of quills. The scriptoria fell silent. The monks laid down their pens. 1,000 years of labor had come to an end. The legacy of the scribes, what remained, though, was not lost. Every printed book of the Renaissance, every rediscovered poem, every philosophical essay, was built upon the foundation the scribes had laid. Monte Cassino, St. Gall, Cluny, Kells, all had done their work so well that the new age could begin where the old one ended. Even as the presses thundered, somewhere a monk still turned a fragile page, whispering the same prayer as his predecessors, Ut in omnibus glorificita Deus. God, in all things God may be glorified. Now, centuries later, when you walk into a modern library or scroll through words on a glowing screen, you are living inside their dream. The preservation of knowledge, once fragile and uncertain, has become part of the world's very fabric. But there is still something haunting about the thought that civilization once depended on the unbroken concentration of a few hundred men, copying in the dark. And so we end this second part with a question that lingers like candle smoke. When the last quill was laid down and silence filled the scriptoria, did the monks feel they had preserved the world, or merely delayed its forgetting? The year is 1520. Europe hums with noise. The presses of Mainz and Venice clatter endlessly, spitting out printed pages that smell of ink and oil. Streets echo with new voices, merchants, scholars, reformers, all quoting words once hidden in dusty monasteries. And yet, far from the cities, in lonely valleys and misty hills, a few monasteries still keep the old rhythm. The sound of bells, the murmur of prayer, and, in the dim light of a small stone room, the scratching of a quill. The scriptorium is dying but not yet gone. Brother Matthias dips his pen into a pot of brown ink. His eyes are failing, his back aches. He copies slowly, not out of duty to Rome or to kings, but because he cannot imagine a world without words shaped by hand. He belongs to the last generation of medieval scribes, men born into silence, living between parchment and prayer, while outside the Renaissance dawns, bright, restless, and loud. The world moves on. The printing press had changed everything. In less than a century, millions of books flooded Europe, cheap, portable, and fast. Ideas that once took decades to spread now crossed borders in weeks. For the first time, people outside monasteries could own books. Students, merchants, even artisans read Aristotle and Augustine, Plato and Pliny. To the monks, this was both miracle and sorrow. Their sacred labor, once the heartbeat of civilization, had become obsolete. No one sent letters requesting hand-copied manuscripts anymore. No one paid for their slow, perfect pages. The scriptoria fell silent one by one. Tables were cleared, windows shuttered. Parchment knives, quills, and ink pots were set aside, some buried in drawers where they would remain untouched for centuries. Yet even as they faded, the monks' influence remained. Every printer in Europe, every scholar who opened a book, was unknowingly standing on their shoulders. Fires and forgetting, but preservation is never safe for long. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was torn apart by war and reform. The Reformation swept across the continent, challenging the authority of monasteries and the church itself. Thousands of abbeys were seized by kings and reformers. Their lands sold, their treasures scattered. Libraries were looted or burned. In England alone, under Henry VI's dissolution of the monasteries, more than 800 religious houses were destroyed. Centuries of knowledge, charters, chronicles, illuminated books, vanished almost overnight. A few scholars, horrified by the destruction, tried to save what they could. They carried boxes of manuscripts into private homes or hid them in attics. Some made their way to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, or the British Museum, where they still rest today, fragments of lives that once belonged to cloistered scribes. But countless others were lost forever, burned for the gold on their covers, torn apart for their bindings, used to wrap food, line shelves, or patch windows. In some English villages, historians later found medieval parchment pages used to repair church roofs. Rain had erased centuries of thought. The silence that the monks had once cherished had turned into something else, the silence of loss. The rediscovery of forgotten words. Yet, curiously, even after the monasteries fell, their books did not stop speaking. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars and explorers began searching Europe for lost manuscripts. They climbed into attics of monasteries that still stood in remote valleys, opened dusty chests, and found treasures forgotten for centuries. In one Swiss abbey, a pile of parchment scraps was discovered behind a wall. Among them, pages of an early Roman play thought lost since antiquity. In St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai, a Greek text of the Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest surviving Bibles, was found by accident, saved only because a librarian refused to let it be burned for kindling. And in libraries like the Vatican, scholars began using new methods. Ultraviolet light, later X-rays, to read erased palimpsests. Words written 1,000 years ago emerged again, faint but alive, like ghosts speaking through layers of time. Every rediscovered text was another thread in the long fabric of survival, woven first by those early monks at Monte Cassino, and still holding fast against the erosion of centuries. The quiet continuation, some monasteries never stopped their work. Even in the modern world, a few abbeys, St. John's in Minnesota, Solesmes in France, Monte Cassino itself, continue to copy text by hand, not because they must, but because they choose to. They write on vellum, they mix their inks, they illuminate pages with patient devotion. It is not nostalgia, it is reverence for time itself. To copy by hand is to resist the rush of the world, to say that a word, once written slowly, becomes a kind of prayer. When you hold an old manuscript, you can see the fingerprints of its maker. Tiny smudges of ink, the slight unevenness of lines, the faint scent of animal skin. It is as if the scribe's presence still lingers, a small proof that even the dullest work, done faithfully, can outlast empires. Monte Cassino's 4 destructions, and yet, even the greatest library cannot escape fate forever. Monte Cassino, the birthplace of this story, has been destroyed not once but 4 times. The first by the Lombards in 577, the second by the Saracens in 883, the third during the Italian Wars in 1349, and the fourth, most tragically, in 1944 during World War II. The Allies, believing the abbey housed German soldiers, bombed it into rubble. Hundreds of civilians and monks were killed. The great library, containing manuscripts that had survived 1,000 years, was reduced to ash. But even then, the monks had prepared. Before the bombing, they had quietly moved the most precious books to safety in Rome. After the war, they returned, rebuilt the abbey stone by stone, and replaced the books on their shelves. Monte Cassino still stands today, its library reborn once more, its silence filled not with despair, but with endurance. It has become more than a monastery. It is a monument to memory itself, the wight of the ordinary looking back. It's tempting to see these monks as heroes, saviors of civilization, guardians of knowledge. But to them, the work was simply ordinary. They did not believe they were saving the future. They believed they were obeying the present, doing what was right, one letter at a time. Perhaps that is why their legacy endures. Civilization rarely depends on great gestures. More often it rests on quiet persistence, on people willing to perform small, dull, necessary acts for lifetimes. Their handwriting became the invisible skeleton of history. Every poem, law, and philosophy we still read passed through their hands. Every modern library is, in some way, their descendant. A candle in the mind, imagine one of those old monasteries tonight. The walls are empty, the rooms still. A few visitors wander through the cloister, their footsteps echoing softly. The air smells faintly of dust and wax. In a glass case lies a book, faded, cracked, the ink brown with age. You lean closer and see, just barely, a note written in the margin 1,000 years ago. Whoever reads this, remember me. You don't know the scribe's name. He has been dead for a millennium. But for a moment, you remember him, and in doing so, you grant his small wish. That is what the librarians of the Middle Ages truly saved, not just words, but presence, the fragile bridge between one human mind and another, across oceans of time. The story of the monks ends not with silence, but with continuity. The world still reads. The libraries still stand. The words still live. And somewhere, perhaps in the corner of a quiet abbey, someone still sharpens a quill and begins to write. So as you drift into sleep, let the echo of their work linger. The faint scratching of a pen, the slow turning of a page, the whisper of words that refuse to die. You wake in the soft half-darkness of dawn. The palace is silent except for the faint rustle of silk robes and the distant murmur of scribes unrolling bamboo slips. This is Chang'an, the capital of the Tang dynasty, the most magnificent city in the world in the 7th century. Outside the red walls, the city is already alive. Merchants from Persia, monks from India, nomads from the steppe. The scent of tea and sandalwood drifts through the air. Horses stamp on the cobblestones. Bells ring from the city gates. But here, inside the palace, all is still. For this is not a city of merchants or monks. It is a city of courtiers, eunuchs, and poets. And at the center of its stillness, like a spider at the heart of a vast web, sits Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. The girl in the shadow of thrones. Wu was not born into royalty. She entered the palace at 14, a concubine of Emperor Taizong, one among hundreds of women who served his court. Her duties were small, tending to the emperor's robes, arranging his books, pouring tea when summoned. Taizong, an aging warrior and administrator, hardly noticed her. But Wu watched everything. She learned how decisions were made, how power moved through whispers, how officials fought and flattered in the name of loyalty. She saw how easily an emperor could be deceived by those closest to him. When Taizong died in 6049, most of his concubines were sent to monasteries to live out their days in quiet seclusion. Wu went too. Her hair was cut, her silk replaced by rough cloth. For most women, that would have been the end of the story. But not for Wu. The return a few years later, a young man visited the temple where she lived. It was Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son and successor. He had once noticed Wu in the palace, long ago, a clever, sharp-eyed girl with a voice that carried calm authority. Now seeing her again, he brought her back to court. The officials murmured disapproval. It was improper, scandalous even, to bring back a concubine of one emperor to serve his son. But Gaozong ignored them. Soon, Wu became more than a servant. She became his confidant, his advisor, his equal in thought. When the empress grew jealous, Wu accused her of killing an infant, a charge historians still debate. The empress was executed. Wu took her place. She was now Empress of China. But that was only the beginning. The empire at her feet, the Tang Empire, was vast, stretching from the Korean peninsula to Central Asia. Its bureaucracy was a labyrinth of scholars and officials, each with a title, each guarding his piece of power. Wu understood that she could not rule through force. She ruled through the one thing the bureaucracy respected: competence. She surrounded herself with secretaries, scribes and record keepers. She listened, read reports, and acted with methodical patience. Where previous rulers favored noble birth, Wu promoted merit. She expanded the imperial examination system, the long, grueling test that allowed ordinary scholars to rise through talent rather than family name. Thousands of men from distant provinces now studied Confucian texts by candlelight, hoping to serve under her reign. Some passed, entering the bureaucracy loyal to Wu alone. And so, quietly, the most male-dominated government in the world came to depend on the intelligence of a woman they had once dismissed as a concubine. The machinery of sleepy power, her court, became a place of endless paperwork. Memorials, petitions, edicts written in delicate calligraphy. The emperor's seal, once a symbol of male strength, now moved under Wu's hand. She worked late into the night, reading reports until her eyes blurred. Her eunuchs whispered to her of gossip and conspiracies. Her scribes recorded her thoughts, careful never to miss a word. Power in her hands was not loud. It was bureaucratic, slow, deliberate, precise. And yet it was absolute. She built alliances by rewarding scholars and punishing arrogant generals. She sent spies into the provinces, replacing corrupt governors with men of humble birth. She ruled not by charm or fear, but by paperwork, a quiet empire of scrolls and signatures. In a world that worshipped emperors as sons of heaven, Wu was both impossible and undeniable. The mask of piety to protect herself, Wu wrapped her rule in religion. She commissioned massive Buddhist projects, statues, temples, and sutras carved into stone. She called herself the Emperor of Heaven's mandate, chosen by fate to bring order to the world. Monks across China preached her legitimacy, writing that she was the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. And while the public prayed, she tightened her grip. The same monks who sang her praises also reported whispers of dissent. Those who plotted against her, courtiers, ministers, even members of her own family, disappeared quietly, their names erased from the court records. Wu understood something timeless about power, that history belongs to those who control the scribes. The calm before the storm. By the time she reached her 60s, Wu had outlasted every rival. Her sons, one after another, proved weak or disloyal. Eventually she took the throne herself, not as empress but as emperor, ruling under the name Zishan Shengwang, holy and divine emperor. Her reign brought peace, prosperity, and administrative reform. Taxes were lowered, granaries filled, borders secured. Yet her name was spoken only in whispers. Some saw her as a usurper, a woman who had stolen heaven's favor. Others saw her as the best ruler China had ever known. And through it all Wu remained calm, her expression serene, her voice measured, her eyes steady. In portraits, she appears neither cruel nor kind, but unreadable, as though her mind belonged to another century entirely. The weight of longevity, time, however, spares no one. In her final years, Wu grew ill. Her ministers, eager for power, pressed her to abdicate. The court she had built, loyal, efficient, and silent, began to splinter. Even as her strength faded, she continued to work from her bed, dictating decrees to her scribes. The last order she signed was written in the same delicate calligraphy that had once been her tool of ascension. When she finally died in 705, her tomb was left blank. No inscription, no titles, no words. It was an odd silence for a woman who had ruled through the written word. Some say it was humility. Others believe it was fear, that her successors erased her legacy. But perhaps in that empty stone, Wu left her truce message that no name, no title, can capture the shape of power once held in quiet hands. Echoes in the bureaucracy centuries later. Historians still debate her. Was she ruthless or visionary, tyrant or reformer? The records were written by men who feared her, men she once commanded. Yet even their accusations cannot hide what she accomplished. Under her rule, China's civil service expanded. Education spread. The idea of merit-based government, now so ordinary, took permanent root. And the bureaucracy she shaped, with all its paperwork and precision, outlived dynasties, emperors, and wars. It became the backbone of Chinese governance for over 1,000 years. Her reign, once whispered as scandal, became the model for order itself. So, as the candlelight fades from the palace halls of Chang'an, you can almost hear the rustle of silk and paper. The sound of a woman rewriting the very structure of empire. And perhaps you wonder, in the silence of her tome, was Wu Zishan truly remembered? Or did she write herself into eternity by choosing to leave her final page blank? You are standing in the Hall of Administrative Affairs, where sunlight filters through carved screens and lands on stacks of bamboo slips and silk documents. It is early morning, and the clerks, hundreds of them, are already awake. They dip their brushes into ink stones. They straighten their sleeves. And then, in synchronized silence, they begin to write. Each movement is deliberate, each stroke permanent. For these words will shape the fate of provinces, decide taxes, define punishments, and alter lives far beyond the palace walls. This is not the China of warriors and poets. This is the China of record keepers, of men who lived and died among scrolls. And above them all, unseen yet omnipresent, is Wu Zishan, the woman who made this entire paper empire breathe. The empire of records. When Wu rose to power, China was already vast, but under her rule it became organized. She saw chaos not as rebellion, but as poor documentation. So she built a machine, not of gears or soldiers, but of scribes. Every province had its own record room, where governors were required to send monthly reports to the capital grain harvests, tax receipts, births, deaths, and local disputes. In turn, the capital issued edicts, precise instructions handwritten by the emperor's secretariat, reviewed by censors, and sealed with red lacquer before being sent out by courier. It was a loop of information that never stopped. Messengers rode through mountain passes and deserts to deliver scrolls, a constant flow of orders and reports, complaints and replies. And at the heart of it sat Wu Zixin reading. She had trained her memory to absorb not just names and events, but patterns. Subtle rhythms in the reports that others missed. A governor's tone too humble, a merchant's profit too precise, a temple's donation too generous. Every word could betray disloyalty or reveal brilliance. The secretaries of the Golden Cabinet, Wu created a special office known as the Jinji, the Golden Cabinet. Here, trusted scribes worked directly under her supervision, compiling intelligence from across the empire. They handled petitions from farmers, accusations against officials, and secret reports from spies. It was said that if a clerk in the Golden Cabinet made a single error in a report, he could be demoted to field labor. For even a misplaced word might alter the emperor's judgment. These scribes became her eyes and ears. They were not noblemen, but scholars, men who had passed the grueling imperial examination, where one mistake in a quotation from the Confucian classics could end a career. Wu rewarded them with silver, land, and influence. But she also kept them afraid. They served her faithfully because she knew their secrets, their ambitions, their rivalries, their desires to rise higher in the ranks. Her power was not only political, it was psychological. She understood that the mind of a bureaucrat is built not on courage, but on fear of imperfection. The examinations before Wu's reign, the examination system had been a ritual, a formality that kept power in the hands of noble families. Wu changed that. She opened the exams to more people, including those from humble backgrounds. She expanded the curriculum beyond Confucian moral philosophy, adding sections on administrative law, poetry, and policy analysis, tests that rewarded intelligence over ancestry. A peasant's son could now, in theory, rise to high office through study, and thousands did. In dim village schools, by the light of oil lamps, boys memorized lines from the Book of Rites and the Analects, dreaming of Chang'an. Some took the exams 3, 4, even 10 times. To pass was to escape poverty. To fail was to return to the fields forgotten. For every man who succeeded, hundreds fell away, the quiet casualties of ambition. And Wu's empire thrived on their effort. Her bureaucracy grew sharper, more literate, more loyal. The palace of women and words, though her court was filled with men, Wu quietly cultivated a circle of women who held influence in subtler ways. In the women's palace, behind layers of silk curtains, she trained female scribes and attendants, women who managed correspondence, oversaw temple donations, and kept watch over the behavior of officials' wives. Their names rarely appear in records, but they were the first of their kind, early administrators, archivists, and auditors. Through them, Wu maintained balance in a court that constantly sought to undermine her. Even in her private chambers, the sound of brushes on silk was constant, the soft, rhythmic whisper of bureaucracy at work, the quiet efficiency of control every system she built. The Golden Cabinet, the examinations, the intelligence network, had a dual purpose. On the surface, they made the government efficient. Beneath, they made it impossible for anyone to act without being seen. Officials wrote in the cautious, polished tone of men who knew their every word could be used against them. Censors reviewed not just actions but intentions. Letters were opened. Reports were cross-referenced. Wu's government was not brutal in the way of tyrants. It was meticulous, precise, almost clinical. To the outside world it appeared calm, an empire of order, where even rebellion seemed impolite. But beneath that calm was tension, the slow tightening of a system that demanded perfection and punished spontaneity. The bureaucrats' lives, most of Wu's clerks never saw her face. They worked long hours copying documents, sitting cross-legged at low desks, ink staining their sleeves. Meals were eaten quickly, rice, tea, a few pickled vegetables. Mistakes were costly, sloppiness fatal to reputation. Some kept personal diaries, describing the monotony of the work, the endless repetition of characters, the fear of miswriting a name. Yet there was pride too. They were the guardians of civilization's memory. They believed that through their writing, chaos could be kept at bay, that their precision was itself a kind of prayer. The Great Census in 6090 CE, when Wu declared herself emperor, she ordered a nationwide census, the most ambitious in Chinese history. Every household, from the mountains of Sichuan to the deserts of Gansu, was recorded names, ages, property, livestock. It took years to complete, and when it was done, Wu's scribes presented her with massive ledgers bound in silk and wood. She reportedly spent days reviewing them. It was not the numbers that interested her, but the knowledge. The feeling that she could hold, in her mind, the outline of the entire empire, its people, its wealth, its pulse. Few rulers in history ever possessed such control, and fewer still achieved it through administration rather than conquest. The dull glory of governance. There is little glamour in this part of history. No battles, no great romances, just the slow, rhythmic turning of a bureaucratic machine that became the backbone of a nation. Under Wu's Zetian, the empire's population grew, agriculture stabilized, trade routes expanded, education flourished. But even success can become its own prison. The system she created, efficient, logical, and unyielding, became so strong that it outlasted her. Future emperors would inherit not just her methods, but her obsession with control. What had begun as a tool of reform became, over time, a cage of paper and ink. The price of perfection. By her 70s, Wu's empire was flawless, too flawless. Officials were so afraid of error that few dared to innovate. Censors wrote more reports about etiquette than about policy. Reform slowed, creativity withered under scrutiny. Wu had succeeded in making the empire calm, but it was a stillness born of fear. And as the old empress lay in her bedchamber, surrounded by scrolls, one wonders if she knew what she had created. A nation that could no longer move without first writing it down. The sound of a pen in the still of night. In some hidden chamber of the palace, a young clerk is finishing his work. His hand trembles slightly as he seals the final scroll with wax. He glances toward the door, half expecting a eunuch to enter, half dreading a mistake he might not even have made. Outside, the moonlight gleams faintly on the rooftops of Chang'an, an empire of tiles and silence. The pen stops, and in that moment, the vast machinery of bureaucracy pauses, not with a shout, but with the softest of sounds. A brush lifted from paper. You can still hear that sound, can't you? The quiet rhythm of a world built on precision and fear, order and devotion. A civilization that believed stability could be written into existence. But what happens when the writer herself begins to fade? When the one who keeps the ledgers loses her strength? Who, then, writes the story? Who decides what remains on the page, and what is erased? The palace of Luoyang lies under a pale winter sky. The wind moves through the courtyards, carrying the faint smell of incense and age. The once bustling city of scholars and traders is quieter now. The streets still glisten with rain, and the merchants still shout, but the energy feels different, cautious, uncertain. The empress, the emperor, is old. Her attendants whisper of weakness, of illness that comes and goes like clouds. Her once steady hand, the one that signed edicts and shaped dynasties, can no longer hold the brush without trembling. But still, she works. Even from her bed, she calls for her ministers. She dictates orders. She listens to petitions, her voice calm and precise, even when her body fails her. To the end, she refuses to let the empire see her as frail. The old empress and her court, by 73 CE, Wu Zetian is in her 80s, a remarkable age in her time. Around her, the court hums with nervous energy. Her ministers, her sons, her lovers, all waiting. Some out of loyalty, others out of ambition. The empress had appointed two favorites in her old age, Zhang Yishi and Zhang Changzong, brothers known for their beauty and flattery. They served as her companions, reading poetry, singing songs, and helping her manage the endless flow of imperial business. But behind closed doors, the officials whispered. They called the brothers corrupt, accused them of manipulating the old ruler for their own gain. The eunuchs carried these whispers through the palace like wind through reeds. Wu heard them. She always did. Yet, instead of punishing, she grew quieter, more reflective, almost detached. The gathering storm, the empire she had ruled for half a century began to crack. Local governors grew more independent. Courtiers, once terrified of her authority, started to form secret alliances. Even her own sons, whom she had sidelined for years, began to conspire for her throne. In the winter of 705, the old empress fell gravely ill. The Zhang brothers, frightened and inexperienced, tried to maintain control of the court in her name. But the army, loyal to the imperial family, moved quickly. A coup erupted within the palace, not with swords drawn in the open, but with silent steps and sealed doors. By dawn, the Zhang brothers were dead, their blood soaking the silk rugs of the empress's chambers. Her son Li Xian was restored as Emperor Zhongzong. And just like that, the woman who had ruled the most powerful empire on earth for more than 40 years was removed from the throne, quietly, efficiently, almost respectfully. No rebellion, no execution. Only silence. The withdrawal Wu was taken to the quiet Shangyang Palace, a residence surrounded by gardens and pools. There, under guard but with dignity, she spent her final days. The same woman who had once commanded armies and censuses now watched her attendants feed koi fish in the ponds. She said little. She asked for no revenge. She read from Buddhist texts, her voice steady but faint. Sometimes she asked to see her old documents, the decrees, the memorials, the poems written in her reign. She would touch the scrolls gently, as if feeling the pulse of an empire through paper. She had always believed that perfection could be achieved through governance, that order could keep the chaos of human desire at bay. But as her vision dimmed, she began to see what perhaps no emperor before her had truly seen. That order, once complete, leaves little room for life itself. The death of an emperor in the summer of 705 CE, Wu Zetian died peacefully, surrounded by silence. Her reign had lasted almost half a century. She had survived plague, famine, rebellion, and scandal. She had built a bureaucracy so intricate that even her successors could not dismantle it. When word of her death spread through the empire, there were no riots, no celebrations, only a collective exhale, a long, wary silence from the people who had lived under her perfect stillness. In Chang'an, the officials began preparing her tomb. They buried her beside her husband, Emperor Gaozong, in the Qianling Mausoleum, a vast resting place carved into the hills of Shaanxi. But there was something unusual about her tombstone. Where every emperor's stele bore an inscription of achievements and titles, hers was left blank, completely blank. No words, no dates, no praise. Just an enormous slab of polished stone standing against the sky. The blank still, historians have debated that blank stone for more than 1,000 years. Was it an act of humility, a final gesture of Buddhist detachment, a renunciation of earthly glory? Or was it vengeance, ordered by her successors to erase her from history? Perhaps it was something subtler, a message left by the empress herself. Wu had ruled by the written word, by records, by reports. She had built a world of language so vast that nothing could move without being written first. And yet, her final legacy was silence, a blank page. It was as if she understood in the end that words could never truly capture what she had been. The contradictions, the achievements, the loneliness of absolute power. Maybe she wanted the future to write her story anew, each generation filling that empty space with its own interpretation. The ghost in the archives centuries past. Dynasties rose and fell. Confucian scholars condemned her as immoral, cruel, unnatural. But others quietly, carefully, admired her. They saw in her rule not chaos but vision. A leader who valued intelligence over birth, who strengthened the state through merit and education. In dusty archives, her decrees survived. Thousands of them. Her handwriting, clear and forceful, can still be seen in fragments preserved on silk. Every few generations, her story would be rediscovered, rewritten by poets, historians, and even emperors who saw in her reflection something both dangerous and inspiring. And the bureaucracy she built never died. Its descendants carried her methods into the Song dynasty, into Ming, even into the modern Chinese civil service, a living monument of ink and discipline. Wu's empire of paper outlasted her flesh. The lessons of stillness. When people speak of history, they often speak of movement, of wars, revolutions, discoveries. But Wu Zetian's story is the opposite. It is about stillness, and what happens when stillness becomes a way of life. Her rule reminds us that civilization often advances not through passion, but through patience, through the slow, deliberate labor of people we never see: clerks, scribes, archivists, the keepers of continuity. It reminds us that control once achieved must eventually give way to time, and that no ruler, however powerful, can escape the quiet gravity of history. And perhaps most of all, it reminds us that silence can speak louder than any inscription. The blank stele above her tomb still stands, wind-worn and immense, its surface reflecting the changing light of every passing century. No name, no words, just emptiness, vast, deliberate, eternal. The echo of the brush, if you listen closely, in that wind-swept valley of Qianling, where the earth holds centuries of secrets, you might almost hear it. The faintest whisper of silk, the softest sound of a brush moving across paper, history writing itself, again and again, across the empty stone. And somewhere in that infinite stillness, the shadow of an empress smiles, not in triumph, but in understanding. For even in silence, her story continues to be written. You wake to the sound of scratching, the faint rasp of a quill on parchment. It is the 12th century, somewhere on the edge of the known world. Outside, rain taps against stone. Inside, a man sits alone in a candlelit cell, hunched over a sheet of calfskin stretched taut on a wooden frame. He is making a map. His name is lost, perhaps a monk, perhaps a scholar. But his creation will survive him by centuries, a circular vision of the world, known as a mappa mundi. It will show continents not as they are, but as people believe them to be. A world made from memory, rumor, scripture, and dreams. And though it is utterly wrong by modern standards, it is, in its own way, a masterpiece. Because before explorers ever set sail, before compasses pointed north, someone had to imagine the shape of the earth. The monastic workshop, the room is small. A single window looks out toward a courtyard filled with herbs, rosemary, thyme, sage, planted for medicine, not flavor. On a long wooden table lie the tools of a medieval mapmaker, reed pens, pots of pigment, fragments of old manuscripts reused for sketches. The mapmaker's fingers are stained blue from ground lapis lazuli. Gold leaf glimmers faintly on the edge of the parchment, waiting to be laid. He works slowly, methodically, as the monastery bell tolls the passing hours matins, lauds, prime. Each ring marks another line drawn, another coastline imagined. For the medieval mind, to draw a map was not an act of geography, but of faith. It was a way to make sense of creation itself. The shape of the world he begins with a circle. The circle represents the world, the orbis terrarum, the orb of lands. Within it, he divides the map into 3 parts: Asia on top, Europe on the lower left, Africa on the lower right. At the center he places Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the world. This design, called a TO map, was simple but profound. The T, formed by the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile, and the Don River, divided the continents. The surrounding O represented the ocean encircling the earth. It was not a map meant for travel, it was a diagram of belief. Above Asia he paints paradise, the Garden of Eden, lush and golden, where the 4 rivers of Genesis flow outward. At the edge of Africa he draws monsters, dog-headed men, cyclopes, people with faces in their chests. They were not meant as fictions but as possibilities, distant, unknowable, yet still part of God's creation. To medieval eyes, everything on the map existed because it was drawn. The sources of knowledge: our mapmaker has never seen the ocean. He has never left the monastery's walls. But he has books. Stacked beside his desk are the works of Isidore of Seville, Pliny the Elder, and Orosius, ancient writers whose words became the foundation of medieval geography. He also has travelers' tales, fragments of letters from pilgrims returning from the Holy Land, sailors' accounts from Genoa and Venice, and vague reports from Muslim scholars whose maps reached Europe through Spain. Piece by piece, he assembles the world from second-hand voices. A trader once described islands to the west where the sun set in fire. A monk told of a mountain that touched heaven in the east. A soldier swore that in Africa, the air shimmered so hot that people's skin turned the color of iron. He copies it all, not doubting, not confirming, simply recording. To him, truth lies not in accuracy, but in order. As long as the world fits within God's plan, the map is correct. The colors of creation he mixes his pigments, carefully: red from cinnabar, blue from lapis, green from malachite, gold for divine light. Each color has meaning. Blue marks the seas, calm and eternal, green for fertile lands, red for cities and roads, gold for sacred places. He paints rivers in fine lines, coiling like veins across the body of the earth. Mountains rise like folded parchment, casting no shadows. It is a world seen from above, yet filled with emotion, a symbolic geography where distance is spiritual, not physical. Rome is large because it matters. Jerusalem gleams because heaven is near. Britain, a small island at the edge, barely fits in the frame. A lonely outpost of faith at the world's rim. The purpose of the map: by candlelight, the monk hums a psalm as he works. He knows this map will hang in the cathedral library, perhaps beside relics and Bibles. It will not guide ships. It will not measure distance. Its purpose is far quieter: to remind the faithful that the world, though vast and confusing, is ultimately ordered. Every place has its meaning. Every river its place in divine architecture. To gaze upon it is to find comfort in pattern. And yet, beneath that pattern lies restlessness, a sense that there must be more beyond the drawn circle. Even here, among the chants and candles, the human mind yearns to know what lies outside the edge. The edge of the map: the edge is the hardest part to draw. Some maps label it simply oceanus, the endless sea. Others fill it with monster serpents, sea wolves, ships falling off the rim. But our mapmaker hesitates. He looks at the blank space beyond the known world and wonders, not in fear, but in awe. He has read of lands to the east where silk comes from, and of kingdoms beyond the desert where spices grow. He knows sailors speak of strange winds and floating islands, and though he does not believe all their tales, something inside him stirs, curiosity faint but unshakable. What if the world is larger than the circle allows? What if God's creation stretches farther than ink can reach? He sets down his brush and looks out the window. The rain has stopped. The courtyard glimmers with puddles reflecting the sky. Perhaps, he thinks, even the heavens are maps, vast diagrams of light and mystery, written by a hand no human can see. The weight of certainty. When the abbot visits to inspect his work, he nods approvingly. It is orderly, the abbot says. It reflects the divine plan. The mapmaker bows. But in his heart he feels a quiet unease. He knows the world cannot be this simple. He has seen the variety of faces among pilgrims, heard languages that twist differently in the mouth. He suspects that the earth is not flat, not circular, not symmetrical. Yet, if he were to draw it differently, who would believe him? Better to keep the circle, to hold the illusion of perfect geometry. For the comfort of others, if not for himself, the quiet completion weeks pass. The map grows brighter, heavier with meaning. Finally, one morning, he adds the last stroke, a golden halo encircling Jerusalem. He leans back, exhausted. His eyes ache, his fingers are numb, but his heart is strangely full. The map glows in the candlelight, a whole world contained in 2 hands' breadth of parchment. He does not know that centuries later, explorers will laugh at it. That sailors will cross oceans he believed impassable. That his monsters will fade into myth, and his world will become a relic of ignorance. All he knows is that he has captured something vast. Not reality, but understanding. In his world, faith and geography are the same thing. And perhaps in that unity, there is a truth modern maps have lost. The circle closes, the bell rings for vespers. He sets aside his quill and washes his hands in cold water. The ink swirls down the basin, blue, red, gold, and disappears. Outside, the wind rises, rattling the shutters. He hears the faint sound of waves somewhere in his imagination. Waves breaking on unseen shores. He smiles softly, not knowing that his small act of faith will one day help shape the age of exploration. Not by its accuracy, but by its imperfection. Because before we discovered the world, we dreamed it, and every dream needs a map. The candle sputters. The parchment glows one last time. In the silence, you realize the first explorers were not sailors or warriors. They were scribes, sitting alone in cold rooms, drawing the edges of imagination. And you wonder, what happens when the circle finally breaks? When someone dares to step beyond the drawn line? You are standing in a port city now. The year is somewhere in the late 13th century, and the air smells of salt, tar, and strange spices from lands that are not supposed to exist. In a merchant's chest, rolled tightly and bound with string, lies a copy of a map mundi drawn by some anonymous monk generations ago. The parchment is cracked and faded, its paint flaking, yet it travels farther than its maker ever did. It crosses borders, languages, oceans. It becomes a silent companion to sailors who believe both in God and in rumor. And as the world begins to move faster, through trade, crusades, and curiosity, the still circle of the old world starts to ripple. From monasteries to markets, the first maps were sacred. They lived in cathedrals and abbeys, displayed on walls where light filtered through colored glass. But by the late 1200s, something begins to change. Europe is waking up, quietly, slowly, like a man opening his eyes after a long sleep. Trade routes open across the Mediterranean. Merchants from Venice, Pisa, and Genoa begin to speak of distant ports: Alexandria, Constantinople, Tunis, and beyond them, lands ruled by kings who worship differently and write in curling, beautiful letters. The map, once a symbol of divine order, becomes a tool of commerce. In dusty scriptoria, monks begin copying not just holy texts but charts. They call them portolan maps, from the Italian portolano, meaning harbour book. Unlike the circular mappa mundi, these new maps are rectangular, filled with lines, radiating like spiderwebs from compass points, connecting port to port. They are practical, mathematical, and, most shocking of all, accurate. The sea, which once marked the boundary of God's creation, now becomes a network of possibilities. The rise of the portolan in a workshop near Genoa. A man named Pietro Vescont bends over a long sheet of vellum. It is the year 1311. He traces coastlines not from scripture but from sailors' logs. He marks winds, depths, and hidden reefs. He invents a new way of seeing, a world measured by experience rather than belief. When finished, his chart shows the Mediterranean like never before, its shape precise, its ports positioned by compass bearings and travel times. To the monks, this map is unsettling. To sailors, it is salvation. Soon every major port in Europe has copies. The portolan charts are rolled, sealed, and stored beside barrels of olives, salt, and silk. The world, for the first time, becomes something you can hold, measure, and use. Knowledge on the move. The new maps spread not through libraries, but through hands, through sailors, merchants, and pirates who rarely wrote their names. Each copy carries small changes. An island drawn larger, a coast nudged north, a rumor added as a note. It is a living document, constantly rewritten. One sailor marks, "Here there be dragons." Another crosses it out, replacing it with, "Here there be whales." Knowledge drifts like wind across the water, reshaping itself with every journey. And in this quiet, practical trade of ink and paper, the old world begins to tilt. The circle of faith bends into the rectangle of discovery. Between faith and function still, even the most precise maps cannot escape the shadow of belief. At the edge of the portolan, beyond the last measured coast, the unknown remains, filled with danger, mystery, and divine warning. No matter how far explorers sail, the sea always ends in imagination. A Catalan cartographer in Majorca, Abraham Cress, creates a masterpiece around 3075, the Catalan Atlas. It combines everything, navigation, science, legend, and scripture, into a vast, colored panorama of the world. Across Africa, he draws the kingdom of Mali, ruled by Mansa Musa, the richest man on earth. Across Asia, he paints Mongol warriors, the Silk Road, and a small figure labeled Prester John, the mythical Christian king said to live beyond the Islamic world. And at the farthest edge of the map, he writes words that could fit almost any century. Beyond here lies the great ocean, whose end no man knows. The map is both faithful and faithless, rooted in religion, yet straining toward reality. It is not the world as it is. It is the world as humanity hopes it might be. The map has power by the 15th century. Maps become more than tools. They become instruments of control. Kings commission them to define their realms. Merchants use them to claim trade routes. The act of drawing a map becomes political, a way of owning a world you may never see. In Portugal, Prince Henry the Navigator gathers map makers at Sagres Point, creating what some call the first school of navigation. Here, mariners and mathematicians combine their secrets, Arabic star charts, Greek geometry, and African coastal notes, into maps that push ever southward, along the edge of Africa. Each voyage returns with new corrections, new names, new outlines. Bit by bit, the edge of the map begins to crumble. The once empty circle of the medieval world tears open. Soon they will find that the ocean does not fall off into darkness, but leads to another hemisphere entirely. But no one knows that yet. The mapper's memory back in Europe, in quiet monasteries and libraries, the old mapper mundi hang untouched. Their gold leaf has dulled, their ink cracked. The monks still believe in the circle. They still teach that the world is ordered around Jerusalem, that paradise lies in the east. But fewer people come to see them now. Pilgrims prefer charts that show roads. Captains trust maps that show distance, not doctrine. The sacred world is shrinking, and yet, even as the new maps rise, the old ones remain beautiful in their silence. For all their inaccuracy, they hold something the new charts cannot assault. They remind people that the world was once seen not just with the eye, but with reverence. Even centuries later, when explorers would redraw the globe, many kept the old circular maps close, perhaps as a reminder of humility. To know everything is to forget the mystery. The language of lines by now, cartography has its own grammar, lines for coasts, dots for cities, crosses for churches, flags for kingdoms. A map becomes a story told in symbols, and as people begin to understand it, they begin to dream differently. A child in Venice looks at a chart of Africa and wonders what kind of birds live there. A monk in Paris copies the name, Cathay, and imagines a city of glass. A sailor in Lisbon stares at the blank space beyond the Azores and feels something stir in his chest, a mix of dread and hope. That space, once filled with dragons, now looks strangely inviting. The map no longer ends at the edge. It invites you to finish it. The turning point by the late 1400s, the circle finally breaks. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus sails westward with maps that are already wrong. Maps that still imagine Asia lies just beyond the Atlantic. He trusts them completely. When he reaches the islands of the Caribbean, he believes he has found the edge of India. And yet, in his mistake lies the greatest transformation of all. Because of those wrong maps, entire continents will be discovered, conquered, reshaped. Every misdrawn line changes the course of history. The world becomes both smaller and infinitely more complex. And behind it all, behind the explorers, the merchants, the kings, stands the quiet legacy of our anonymous monk, drawing his first circle by candlelight. He did not mean to begin the age of discovery. He only wanted to understand the world. But understanding, once drawn, has a way of spreading. The map's secret life somewhere, In a dusty archive, the monk's original Mappa Mundi still exists. The parchment has darkened, the gold faded. Its monsters look quaint now, almost kind. But if you trace the edges carefully, you can see faint marks, tiny, almost invisible corrections. A small line extended slightly farther west, a sea made a little wider. It is as if even he, in his quiet monastery, felt the world shifting beneath his quill. Maybe he sensed that his circle would not hold forever. The quiet revolution, we often imagine revolutions as loud, but the revolution of maps was silent, a slow, deliberate rewriting of how humans thought about space, distance, and destiny. Each new line redrew not just geography, but belief. The Earth, once a stage for divine drama, became a place of discovery. Heaven no longer hovered above the circle, it receded into abstraction. And humanity, once the audience of creation, became the explorer, the author, the mapper of reality itself. It is one of history's strangest paradoxes. The more accurate our maps became, the smaller our sense of wonder grew. But somewhere between the circles and the grids, between the prayers and the compasses, the world learned to move. The candle in the mapmaker's cell has long burned out, but his circle lives on in every modern globe, hidden beneath layers of precision. The echo of his faith still whispers beneath longitude and latitude, beneath every line we draw to make sense of the world. Because to map the world is not just to measure it, it is to imagine it. You close your eyes and imagine the old parchment rolling itself shut, as if resting. The journey from sacred circle to measured rectangle is complete, yet something remains unresolved. If the world can be drawn, can it ever truly be known? Or does every new map simply hide the mysteries we cannot yet name? You are standing now in a great hall filled with instruments, globes, astrolabes, telescopes, and charts that stretch across the table like unrolled dreams. The date is sometime in the 16th century. Europe hums with ambition. Ships leave every month from Lisbon, Seville, and Bristol, their sails full, their hulls groaning with cargo and fear. And everywhere, men are drawing, redrawing, the world. What began as a circle of faith has become a network of power. The map, once a quiet act of imagination, is now an engine of empire. The world redrawn. When Columbus returned from his first voyage, the news spread faster than wind. Printers in Nuremberg, Venice, and Paris worked feverishly to redraw their maps. The world had cracked open, and suddenly space itself became valuable. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemler engraved a massive wall map. It was the first to use a new word for the western lands, America. He based his information on letters from explorers, travelers' hearsay, and pure speculation. The coastlines were only roughly traced, a suggestion of shape rather than certainty, and yet his mistake became permanent. One line etched in wood and printed on paper altered the language of geography forever. It is hard to imagine the shock those early viewers must have felt, to see a whole new continent drawn before their eyes. The world they thought they knew was suddenly too small. The map as weapon exploration did not remain innocent for long. Soon every new map became a claim, every coastline a possession. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the entire world between two nations, Spain and Portugal, based on a line drawn across the Atlantic Ocean. A single vertical stroke of ink decided the fates of continents, oceans, and millions of people. It did not matter that the map was inaccurate. The line was legal, and in the eyes of kings and popes, that made it real. The world became something to be measured, parceled, and owned. Sailors, armed with compasses and charts, no longer sailed into mystery. They sailed into opportunity. Each voyage carried two cargoes, gold and knowledge. Each map brought back both discovery and destruction. The age of precision in the 17th century, as telescopes improved and mathematics matured, maps became astonishingly accurate. In Amsterdam, the Bleu family published atlases that glittered with color and geometry. Their Atlas Maya contained more than 600 maps, every page a triumph of precision. Across Europe, scientists began to measure the world with instruments, not imagination. The Earth was surveyed, its size calculated, its shape corrected. The circle was gone. In its place stretched a grid, neat, logical, perfect. The new maps looked almost modern, coastlines crisp, latitude lines intersecting, names spelled in careful Latin. But with precision came a strange loss. The monsters were gone, the paradises erased. The blank spaces that once invited wonder were now filled with borders and statistics. For the first time in human history, the entire world could be seen, but not necessarily understood. The mapmakers of empire in London, Paris, and Madrid, entire offices of cartographers worked under royal commissions. They drew colonial boundaries that cut through jungles, mountains, and villages they would never visit. Sometimes, they drew those lines in the wrong place. Sometimes they didn't care. To the mapmaker, the world existed in ink. To those who lived on that land, the map was a ghost that would soon become real. The 18th and 19th centuries became the great age of imperial cartography, a time when nations measured power not in faith or faithfulness, but in miles. Maps justified conquest. They turned rivers into borders and deserts into frontiers. When the British surveyed India, they called it the Great Trigonometrical Survey, a mission of science. It took nearly 70 years, cost countless lives, and involved measuring mountains with tools no larger than a spyglass. But behind that precision lay something older, the same yearning for control that drove the monk to draw his circle centuries before. Only now, it was not spiritual control, but political. The mapper's mirror, you can still imagine our first mapmaker, if you close your eyes. His candle burns low. His hand trembles slightly as he draws the circle, the rivers, the mountains. He meant it as devotion. But over time, that devotion transformed into dominion. The map became a mirror of the human mind, first humble, then curious, then hungry. Every new discovery demanded another, every correction another error to fix. We began to confuse seeing with knowing. If a place could be mapped, we believed it could be understood. If it could be understood, it could be governed. And if governed, then owned. What began as a prayer became a conquest. The shadows beneath the grid, yet not every map was made by empires. Some were drawn by dreamers, still faithful to mystery. In the 17th century, a Japanese cartographer named Ishikawa Ruzen painted maps of the world that combined myth and measurement. He showed the continents as elegant shapes, surrounded by curling clouds and dragons. His seas shimmered with gold leaf. His maps were both scientific and poetic, halfway between imagination and truth. Even in the age of reason, art refused to vanish from geography, because, deep down, humanity still longed for wonder. The world, no matter how well measured, remained too vast for logic alone. The blue marble. Centuries later, in 1972, a photograph taken from space would show the entire planet floating in darkness. The blue marble. It was the first true map of Earth ever made by no human hand. No coast distorted, no sea imagined, just the whole fragile sphere lit by sunlight. In that image, the circle returned, not as belief, but as reality. The world was round again and small, and once more, people felt something ancient awe. After centuries of grids and claims, the map became simple again, a picture of home. The eternal return. Every age redraws the world in its own way. The medieval monk drew it for faith. The Renaissance explorer drew it for discovery. The imperial surveyor drew it for power. The modern scientist draws it for data. But beneath every line, every coordinate, every pixel, lies the same human impulse to know where we are. To map something is to place yourself within it. That's why the first map, that small, gold-painted circle, still matters. It was never meant to control the world. It was meant to belong to it. Perhaps that's the real reason we keep drawing, measuring, and naming, because we fear being lost, not just in geography, but in time. The circles whisper, imagine the monk again, long gone, his map buried in a library somewhere. If you could see our satellites, our GPS, our glowing screens that chart every corner of the earth, what would he think? Perhaps he would smile gently and say, "You have drawn the world perfectly." But can you still see it? Because to map something is not the same as to understand it. His map was wrong, gloriously wrong, but it contained something we have almost forgotten, a sense of place within mystery. He left room for dragons, for paradise, for the divine. We left only coordinates. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we miss when we look at our perfect, empty maps. The final line. As night falls over the modern world, the globe spins silently, dotted with cities glowing like stars. Each point of light is a map in itself. Someone's home, someone's world. The great dream of mapping has come full circle, from belief to reason, from art to empire, from mystery to measurement, and perhaps now back to wonder. The lines still move, the ink still flows, and somewhere, in the quiet of our imagination, the old monk still draws. You breathe slowly, letting the thought settle. The world outside fades into the hum of quiet sleep. You think of all the maps you have ever seen, in books, on walls, on screens, and realize that each one is only a reflection of the same ancient desire to know the shape of home. And with that, the candle goes out. The circle closes.